Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. I am thrilled and frankly surprised to see so many of you out here on a rainy Monday evening, so thank you so much for coming. And of course, many thanks to Father Goff for organizing this and the kind invitation to speak today, and also of course to Father Bianco for his support of this colloquium as well. I really have to hand it to Father Goff for identifying a small pack of medievalists who are involved in the Cathedral of Mary our Queen in some way, either as a deacon or working in administration or just a parishioner like myself. So thank you for doing this, and it's so nice to speak to sort of my home parish, which is really nice thing for me to do because I've never ever done that before, and I talk about art all the time. So tonight I wanted to talk to you about a very important concept which is really foundational to the creation of the incredible medieval church objects and manuscripts that survive in large part in museums and libraries today, not actually in the places that they were made for. And one very important place where they survive is the Walters Art Museum, where I am curator. So tonight I'm just going to talk you through some of the objects at the Walters and some of the objects right across the road here in our own cathedral. So hopefully you'll, if you can't hear me, please raise your hand and I'll try to speak up. I'm not used to having a mic in my hand. I tend to project, so I hope I don't project into the mic because then you'll want to cover your ears. I became a medievalist in large part because of the objects and images, kind of like we have here on the screen. I really wanted to understand what prompted the creation of these incredibly luxurious and costly objects that were often made to be placed and used within Christian churches and monasteries. At its core, such precious materials as gold, silver, gemstones, expensive imported pigments, and calfskin were deemed to be materials appropriate for enshrining things like the relics of saints, as you can see here on the left with the reliquary of Saint Pantaleon that is in the Walters Art Museum, or materials that were deemed worthy to bear the word of God. In this case, a handwritten manuscript known as the Beaupre Antiphonary on the right, also in the Walters collection. Now the Beaupre Antiphonary I want to spend another minute on because it's really a fantastic example of these luxury materials, and it really gets at the crux of patronage and this idea of ensuring one's place in heaven. So if some of you might be familiar, to me, maybe you're all familiar, antiphonaries. Does anyone know what an antiphonary is? What kind of things it contains? I think you can all see it contains music. Yes? Correct. So the sum portions of the divine office. So these are the sorts of books that would have been used both in monasteries, also in churches as well. And this particular antiphonary is a multi-volume antiphonary that was made for a convent in Beaupré, which is at the time in the Middle Ages, it was considered part of France, but is today part of Belgium near Cambrai, the Diocese of Cambrai. And we have several volumes of this antiphonary. There were two sets that were made around 1290, and half of them were made for the abbess of the monastery, and the other half were made for the prioress. And so what I'm showing you here right now, I believe, is one of the abbess's volumes, and this would have been used to sort of lead her half of the chant. And you might notice, well, we have a few things going on here, but we have an initial A with the image of Christ's resurrection at the top here, and then the three Marys at the tomb, visiting the tomb just below, and this very large initial A. If you can't sort of pick it out, my eye is super attuned to it, but you're looking at a large A there beginning the chant Angelus, and actually the scribe has made it easy for us because he's repeated that A, and the Angelus sometimes just goes right on to Angelus. So in the border, though, I wanted to draw your attention to two additional figures beyond the biblical narrative that's happening in the center of the initial. We have two female figures here, and I don't know if all of you in the back can really see these. They are inscribed over their heads, identifying who they are. And so at the top, I'm going to check my notes on this one, we have what might look initially to you, I just told you this is a book used by nuns. It might look like nuns to you, but they're actually dressed as lay women. So the woman right next to the initial has an ermine-lined cape, so you know that's probably not a nun. And then we have another woman just down below, and they're both called Domicilla, so you know that they're not sort of not of a religious order. They are inscribed at the top with the name of the Divina family, which actually sponsored the creation of these books. So a wealthy family, probably spearheaded by this woman that we see there, and down below, perhaps the one below as well, spearheaded the creation of these books by donating funds for their creation. I think you can see by looking at it, there's a great amount of gold leaf. Antiphonary, because they would have been sung from by a group of people, were quite large in nature. So this particular book is about yay high, and then open it up, and it's sort of, you know, it would cover more than this lectern that I have right here. So this is an incredible amount of animal skin. This has to be saved up for a lot of time. And you have to also, some of these pigments that you see here, this blue, I don't know what particular blue was used here, but certain blue pigments were meant to be imported from places like Afghanistan, if you're talking about lapis lazuli. So a very great expense was paid for this whole set of these choir books, not just this one page. Imagine entire volumes in a multi-volume set. So this really gets at the crux, I think, of what I'd like to be talking about today, and why you know, it's so important not just for them to have sponsored this creation, but to have themselves imaged in this book. So think about what this means. They're right next to these words that are biblical words that are sung during holy services. They are in the presence of these biblical narratives. They are almost on the same scale as the figures in the three Marys, for example, and Christ. And they are kneeling in prayer. So they're shown in their pious sort of behavior, but they're also very much present in this book that would have been used in these holy spaces like a monastery, like a convent. And so every time the nuns of this convent sung from this book, they were not just contemplating the words they were singing, the imagery that they saw, they were thinking about these women who contributed the money for the creation of these incredible volumes. So every time those songs are sung, it's like saying another prayer for that individual. And primarily, of course, the ultimate goal was that this would somehow ensure the donors a place in heaven, that they were sort of ensuring the salvation of their souls by being remembered every time that these things were sung from. Now, I should say, every chant was only sung once during the liturgical year, so you know, maybe once a year you'll pray for it. But I believe this is not the only instance where you see these donor figures in the margin in this set of choir books. Now, I don't want to digress too much, but I have to tell you about some of the subsequent owners of these manuscripts after the convent presumably sold them off at some point during their history, because there's a lot of layers here. These volumes were actually owned by John Ruskin, who was an incredible 19th century writer. He was also kind of a medievalist at heart. He collected a lot of medieval art, and he liked to do whatever he felt like with his manuscripts, including cutting out pages, cutting out initials. In this particular set of books, he actually scratched out some of the marginal decoration, not on this page. But anyway, this is a fun bit of history, especially for those of us who are medievalist. And this set of choir books was actually given to the Walters, not by our founders, and I'll talk about them in a little bit, but actually by the Hearst Foundation. Does anyone know the founder of the Hearst Foundation? William Randolph Hearst, the famous businessman and newspaperman, and you might be familiar with his home, San Simeon in California, where many of his art collections lived for a long time, and he was quite a big donor to places like the Metropolitan Museum. I don't actually know how much we have from Hearst at the Walters, but this is a fantastic example of one object that he himself donated to us. Just to talk for a minute about the idea of donors and patrons and these words that I've kind of been throwing around. I should put my cell phone on this stand so I know exactly how much time I'm taking. Obviously, objects like these were made by very skilled craftsmen and artists. Unlike in later periods where we have quite a few names of these artists and they've survived in archival documents or the artists have signed their work, so we have some sort of record there. This is actually relatively infrequent for the medieval period. And there's a reason for this. It's a relatively simple reason. While skilled craftspeople were certainly known for their artistry and sought after for their artistry, the greater importance really lay less on the individual who created the piece by actually making it, but the individual who paid for the object. So, and by that I mean namely the patron. So sometimes the patron is referred to as the donor of the artwork, and I think this comes from the ultimate donation of objects like this to a foundation like church, rather than having it created for personal use. So I have to always say this because, as Father Goff mentioned, I am all about patronage, but I'm so close to it that I just throw these words around all the time. So what we're talking about, you sort of keep these images in your head of these two figures in the margin, and that might help you sort of remember how to really think about patrons and donors in the Middle Ages. They are, in fact, the ones who were held really responsible for the creation of all the artworks that you see during this period. So tonight I'd like to show you a few examples from the Walters collection, from the early Middle Ages to the late Middle Ages, and even getting into the Renaissance a little bit, just to give you a sense of the range of the kinds of objects that were commissioned by different individuals. What we know of their identities also, and what were their aspirations, what were their goals. There's a lot we can actually tell from the objects that they left to us. Again, documentation is rather thin in this period, but I think the objects really speak of their motivations and why they would do something or have something created like this that you see here on the screen. And then once I go through a few Walters objects, I'll shift to our modern day patron, Thomas O'Neill, who was the sponsor and the patron of the Cathedral of the Mary Our Queen. That's sort of the end part of my talk. So we'll bring it right up to the present day with this talk. So I show you here on the screen just one part of, you can call it a hoard or a treasure that we have at the Walters Art Museum of Byzantine silver. This treasure was found in Syria in a place called Patronage, which in modern day terms is called Kurin. But these objects were made in the town of Patronage, as it was called at that time, in the early 7th century CE. I showed you just one object from the hoard here, but this is obviously a chalice. But there's a paten, there are various other liturgical implements, picks, various sorts of tools that were used in the Greek Orthodox, so we call today the Greek Orthodox Mass of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And what's fascinating about these pieces of liturgical wares is that several of them have the names of their patrons, the people who paid for them to be made, are inscribed on the objects themselves. So this is going back to the 7th century now. I am a short person, so I can't point all the way at the top, but if you look just under the rim of this chalice, you might be able to see some Greek lettering there. So that is actually spelling out the actual names of the donors, and it wasn't just one donor. It seems that different families paid for different pieces within the same matching set of liturgical items. So it was a real kind of group effort. Obviously, incredibly, this is solid silver, and if your eyes are not playing tricks on you, if it looks a little bit yellow in some parts, there's actually gilding on the surface of the silver. You can see it in the archways, some of the garments that the saints are wearing. They're kind of all around the bowl of this chalice, all in veneration of the cross that you can see just peeking around on the right-hand side there. So here are the patrons sort of actually declaring themselves in those inscriptions. And same is true as we saw in the Beaupre antiphonary. You can imagine that when the priest used this in the Mass, it was like saying a prayer for that individual again and again. So a little bit of a higher ratio than the Beaupre antiphonary. This is more of a daily or a weekly sort of use for something like this. So really quite remarkable that you would have the name of a layperson actually on the objects being used at that time in the Holy Eucharist. And I do want to note before I move on that all of these works that I'm showing you here, if you are taking notes, I put the accession number at the bottom of each caption there. All of these objects are on our website. You can download images of them for free at very high resolution. You can make them into t-shirts, you can make them into tote bags, whatever you like. And you can also learn more about them there. So there's a lot more information about these pieces than what I'm sharing with you this evening. So please, at your leisure, go back, look at our website. Our manuscripts are on a separate, dedicated website, and you can actually flip through the whole Beaupre antiphonary if you would like. It is fully digitized, as many of our manuscripts are, and that is on our Walters Ex Libris website. So remember your Latin, Ex Libris. And you can flip through entire manuscripts, much more than what I'm showing you tonight. Let's see. So moving a bit ahead in time, but not that much later than the Beaupre antiphonary, I wanted to show you a reliquary that we have in our collection. This is an interesting example. I won't make you guess what it is because you all know, and it's also written on the screen. This is a reliquary that was meant to house, actually, a relic of the Passion. So when we start to talk about relics and reliquaries, the problem with Christ is that there just aren't that many relics associated with him because, anybody know why? I heard someone say he was assumed bodily, right? So a lot of the relics that we have from the Middle Ages of saints are relics, are body part saints. You're not going to have that with Christ. So here, what you have is actually relics of instruments of his passion. So I think you can see that. So first of all, you have Christ in his suffering state here in the middle, surrounded by all these instruments of his torture. So he's wearing the crown of thorns with actually a ruby in the crown of thorns, sort of giving that sense of blood and his wounds. You have the cross here. You have the cock right there that crowed 3 times. You have these angels below who are holding, again, the nails for his crucifixion, that hammer that the nails were driven into his hands and feet. And you have also, I'm not sure what's going on in the middle there, I've forgotten for the moment. I think this is actually where the relic originally was. So what was here was one of the thorns from the crown of thorns. And so this incredibly beautiful, and this, I don't know if you've ever seen, has anyone seen this in person? This is an arresting piece. It is top to bottom gold. It's not very big, it's about this big, maybe about 1 foot tall. But incredible goldsmith work sort of expended on this particular piece, all in the service of venerating this relic that would have been contained within. Now, maybe I want to give Father Goff any ideas here, but at the bottom, we have another inscription, which I know you can't read, but it actually calls out the name of the patron, which you might guess where I'm going with this, who is actually Bishop John Volek, who was Bishop of Olomouc in what we now call Moravia. And it says actually on here that he commissioned this piece very, very explicitly. So here we have not a lay person, but actually a bishop calling out his own patronage of this incredible reliquary, which was made at probably very high cost. There are coats of arms on the corners here, one of which is the bishop's own coat of arms, and the other of which is the coat of arms of Charles IV of Bohemia. Very important king during this early part of the 15th century. Sorry, 14th century, I've got my centuries right. And he actually was the owner of that crown of thorns relic. So the thought is that Bishop John gave the money for this reliquary to enshrine this relic that Charles had, and he gave it as a gift to Charles. So this is kind of a very interesting form of donation. It's not really Charles giving it to the church, it's the church kind of giving it to Charles in a way, but he had the relic. So in any case, I should also note here that the dice here as well, gambling over Christ's garments. So this is an incredible, this might be not so exciting to you, but when I see the names of individuals from the Middle Ages on things like this, I mean, that is really bringing these things to life for me, and really giving us a clear picture of who these people were and what they were sort of thinking about, because we don't have a lot of people recording those thoughts from this period. So for me, it's really these key objects that brings that all to life, and why would somebody do that? Yes, question?
Is the thorn still in there?
No.
Where is it?
Good question. So I get this question a lot with reliquaries. We have quite a few at the Walters. Very few of those still have their original relics inside. So what happened with some of these objects is that the churches that own them, as you might know, especially in the 19th century, during the French Revolution, these monasteries were sort of decommissioned. Various sorts of things happened where these churches and monasteries were sometimes under great financial duress. So they might sell off something like this, but they would usually preserve the relic in some way and at their own foundation. Now that said, we do have one reliquary at the Walters that still has a fragment of bone in it. We don't know which saint it was associated with. This is lost to history. But most reliquaries that you see in museums typically do not have that holy relic still inside. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Is another hand back there? Yes.
So you said that piece from the crown of thorns is no longer in there.
Correct. Okay. Yes. So don't put your nose on the glass at the museum. You can, but yes, no. So there's no relic in this particular reliquary at this time. So this is actually maybe a fairly unassuming piece, but it's actually one of my favorite pieces in the Walters collection. So this is a piece that some of you might be able to identify as a monstrance. Unlike modern day monstrances that are made from glass in the Middle Ages, you would have used something known as rock crystal. That was sort of the most transparent type of material you could get your hands on. Not really, they did make glass in the Middle Ages, but obviously, but this was a sort of appropriate, very fancy, glass is not fancy, this is fancy, rock crystal is relatively rare, way to make a vessel that you could actually see through and to, monstrance just comes from mostrare, or to show, to demonstrate, that you could actually see through to the contents of this piece. So we do call this a monstrance in the Walters collection. I do have a few doubts about that. I'm not exactly sure, what, it is empty at this point, but it probably originally held a relic. It might have perhaps held a host. We have here an example, obviously again, in these very precious materials. We have not just gold, we have this enamel work all over the piece itself. We have an incredible goldsmith work at the top where it's almost like a little mini cathedral, kind of Gothic architecture at the very top of the monstrance, and also this rock crystal vessel at the very center. Now this isn't just any old monstrance, because there is also kind of a somewhat hidden inscription here, right around sort of knob on the monstrance. And it tells us also who the name of the patron was. And her name was Taddea Petrucci. So we have a woman who we believe lived in Florence in the 14th century. And it says not just her name, but also why she commissioned it. So not just Bishop John saying, oh, I commissioned this piece. So what Taddea says is, Mistress Taddea Petrucci had this receptacle made for the salvation of her dead. So what does that mean? So she's not doing this actually for herself. She is doing this for her various loved ones who passed away in her life. Does anyone know what was happening in Florence in the mid-14th century when this was made? Yes, the plague was really raging, wiped out a significant portion of the population of Florence. So she is commissioning this not for herself, not for her own benefit, but for all the people that she's lost, even though, of course, she knows she will eventually suffer a similar fate at some point in her life. So, I would say leave it to a woman to do this selfless act, right, as opposed to some of the other things we've seen. So, again, I mentioned earlier that we have this patrons and we don't have a lot of records of their names. This is even more true of women and women patrons. So it's really remarkable that we have this example here where it very clearly not only states her name, but also states exactly what her purpose was in commissioning this piece. Oh, sorry, I had a plague slide here for you. This is another painting in the Walters collection. And it's actually kind of showing the mechanism of how these objects would have worked in terms of prayer in a way. This is actually a painting of the Saint Sebastian acting as intercessor. He's way up there in the sky. He's interceding on behalf of this individual in the very front. We have some folks who are burying those who passed from the plague. And the one right at the back of the grave, he has just also succumbed himself in that very moment. So Saint Sebastian, who is patron saint of the plague, is up in sort of the heavenly realm, interceding on behalf of that individual and probably the one being buried as well, on behalf of interceding for him with either, it's hard to tell, I think it's probably God here, but God or Christ. And he is, this is, again, it's functioning like these reliquaries function in the sense that when you have a reliquary like this, it is believed that you are in the presence of that saintly individual. So it's, if you are saying your prayers, your devotions in front of this object, that is your vehicle to communicate with the saint contained within. Leave it there. Yes?
Is that the same figure on the top of the monstrance? Is that supposedly representing Saint Sebastian, do you think?
That's a good question. I think we probably do know who that is, or we might not actually. I don't think we know who that is because I have looked into that. It's not Taddea, I can tell you that. But there are actually several saints associated with the plague. Saint Roch is another one of them, San Rocco in Italian. So I don't know, I don't think we actually know who that was because that doesn't actually have an inscription. That's an excellent question. And also, it's a clothed figure. Usually when you do see Saint Sebastian, he's nude and covered with arrows piercing his flesh. So I think we don't have Saint Sebastian there, but that would have been a very appropriate thing to have on something like this, yeah. More questions on the policy? Yeah.
Were these items made for the personal use of the people that engaged the artist to do them, or were they made to be given to the church?
Yes, so the question, in case you didn't hear it, was, were these objects made for the church, or were they made for the individual who commissioned them? That's an excellent question. For the most part, these were destined for chapels within churches. And so many people could, it's giving access to many different people who could pray in front of them and then ultimately on behalf of the patron. Sometimes people did have them if they were very wealthy individuals, they might have a private chapel in their homes, and then they could actually have some objects like this, but quite often they were made and donated to churches. Yeah.
So when Henry Walters acquired this, was he acquiring it from private ownership at that time? They had passed back to private ownership?
That's an excellent question. Our dear patron Henry did not leave loads of records in most cases. He worked with certain art dealers, and we do have those records. This particular one, I don't know that we know anything beyond him acquiring it. Now, that too is on our website, so all the provenance information that we have to hand is also listed on our website, so I would encourage you to check that, but I think this may be all the information we have about this particular piece. Is that a hand? Yes?
Question, it looks like above the populace, Saint Sebastian, there looks to be someone genuflecting or praying.
Yes, I know it's very hard to see, and I apologize. He is kneeling in prayer with his hands folded in prayer, yeah.
Is that anybody particular or not necessarily? Anyone, it could be anyone.
Sorry, are you referring to the figure of Saint Sebastian, or?
In the center, it seems to be genuflecting. That is in the sky. Yeah.
Way up in the sky?
Yes.
That is Saint Sebastian himself. So, and he is kneeling and praying before God or Christ. It's a little bit hard to see there. I think it's actually.
Okay.
I think it's God. He's got the orb.
Thanks. No,
Yeah.
I misinterpreted.
No, believe me, it's very easy to misinterpret medieval images all the time. Okay. So I wanted to show you one example sort of towards the end of the Middle Ages, and actually at the Walters, my period, as you heard, cuts off at the year 1400, but for most people, the Middle Ages kind of go up to the year 1500. So we have this incredible stained glass window here, showing the portrait of a very important French king of the late Middle Ages, King Louis XII of France. And he is shown here in prayer Obviously, not only just kneeling and his hands folded in prayer, just like Saint Sebastian, he also has his prayer book, probably a book of hours, in front of him on a prie-dieu in front. This comes from a series of windows, so there were other sort of images of him throughout these windows. And the interpretation that we have on our website right now is, if you can see the space he's in, he's actually got a curtain behind him there. So he's kind of in an enclosed space, perhaps a private area of a church where he was allowed to pray because of his particular status. He had his own little private area. It could also allude to a chapel he had at his home. That's a possibility. Louis XII was actually a huge patron of manuscripts. He had many, many books of hours, one of which is sort of only survives in pieces, and there's a very similar image from that book of hours at the Getty Museum showing Louis XII in exactly this pose and exactly in this way. That particular manuscript image, he's surrounded by his personal patrons, and he is facing in this direction. Now, if this were a book, you need something on the facing page. So it's a recto. So over here, King Louis XII. He was probably facing an image of the Blessed Virgin. So imagine opening up your prayer book and seeing yourself in that book, in that act of prayer, what you're actually doing. I mean, it's pretty meta, I have to tell you. So I'm not showing you that image here, but if you go to the Getty's website, you can easily find that page, and it's very similar to this window that we have at the Walters. So here, he's imaging himself in the sacred context. This window was probably itself in a church context, in a church window, and it's showing him in that act of piety. So he's sort of expressing, him in his sort of ideal state, how he would like to be remembered by the people who come and see this in the church, by the priests who perform the Mass in that space, and so forth and so on. Shifting gears slightly. So I've been showing many objects, as you know. They come from the Walters Art Museum. And many of the things that you see, including the building, including the objects that we've seen here, are obviously also the products of philanthropic patronage. I was being asked a little earlier tonight about the short history of the Walters. We have a much longer history of the Walters on our website. We've actually recently edited it and sort of made it a little bit more explicit about the background of our founders. It was set up by a father and son set of collectors. So William was the father and Henry was the son. They collected throughout the second half of the 19th century, the father did, and then Henry continued that on into the 20th century. Some of you might know we're very well known for our collection of 19th century art, in addition to medieval art, and they were actually collecting their own contemporary artists at that time. So the buildings that you see here, this one here and the adjacent building, which is not in this photo, was the original, Henry's original gallery space that he opened up about once a month during his lifetime for the public to come and view his art collection. He and his father amassed about 22,000 objects, so that is the core of our collection even today. We now have 36,000 objects at the Walters. Our strengths include, like I said, 19th century art, old master painting, manuscripts, medieval manuscripts, Asian art, Islamic art, and of course, I think most importantly, the medieval objects collection, but also an incredible collection of medieval manuscripts. And I should say ancient Egypt, Greek, and Rome as well. Very strong, and a lot of their collecting interests lay there as well. Upon his death in 1931, Henry decided to bequeath that whole collection and these two buildings, and importantly, an endowment to care for that collection to the city of Baltimore. And the way he stated this was, it was for the benefit of the public. So he was actually really thinking about this. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't that selfless, but it sounds really selfless what he was doing. And in fact, that's why we still benefit from it here today at the Walters. And so I hope you can all come and see the collection at some point. So this tradition of ecclesiastical patronage and sort of modern day patronage continues with our very own Cathedral of Mary, our Queen, in a way that I hadn't really quite appreciated until preparing for this talk. So some of you might know perhaps the story even better than I do of the creation of the cathedral edifice, which, as the story goes, was sponsored by just one man, Thomas O'Neill. And from what I learned of Thomas O'Neill during my time preparing for this talk, he immigrated to Baltimore from Ireland in 1866, and he was just 16 years old at the time and did not have a penny to his name. He seems to have fulfilled the American dream. He first apprenticed himself to a linen shop in downtown Baltimore, but by the age of 33, he established his own dry goods store named O'Neill's on Charles Street in Lexington. And that was there into the 1950s, much after his death. He expanded the building here in Baltimore. He branched out internationally with his business to Paris, Dublin, and London. He had offices, sort of an outpost there. And however, in 1904, some of you might know, was the Great Baltimore Fire, which really ravaged the downtown area and came incredibly close to O'Neill's. Now, the story that I read, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas O'Neill realized that the fire was coming awfully close to his store, so he darted over to the Carmelite convent nearby on Biddle Street and asked for the nuns to please pray that the fire would spare his store. Well, he went back to attend to his store, and at the last moment, the wind changed direction, and the fire stopped and didn't destroy his edifice. And so, in gratitude for that, for having his business saved, he wound up leaving a small fortune, actually quite a large fortune at the time, $5 million, for the creation of a new cathedral for Baltimore. Now, various things happened. He died himself in 1919, so he left his money for this construction at that time, but he also didn't want the money spent before his wife had passed, and then several wars ensued, having nothing to do with Thomas, obviously, and he eventually, the money sort of, actually was a good thing, because the money continued to accrue value, and so it was more like over $8 million that was able to be spent on the creation of this cathedral that is right next to us here. And of course, the building itself was completed, as many of you know, in 1959. So it's kind of got a bit of a modern flavor to it, but it's calling back to the very much medieval art in its parts of its construction, in its decoration. And even though it was constructed much after Thomas's passing, his mark is he's still remembered very much in this building, not just for people like me telling his story, but also in the imagery and the decoration of the cathedral. And some of you might know this already, but I'll bring it a little bit closer into focus. So there are two spots in the cathedral that have imagery of Thomas, and I thank Father Goff and Father Bianco for telling me exactly where those were, because I was a little confused. Starting in the memorial chapel, so as you face the high altar, you have one of the chapels on the sort of south side, or south flank of the church, rather large chapel, again known as the memorial chapel. On the outside of as you look up just above the doorway to the chapel, you have these, I'm sure you've all noticed, these various stone reliefs here, and the one over the memorial chapel is actually dedicated to St. Francis. You can probably see there Francis communing with the animals above the doorway, and I'll come back to this in just a minute. But entering the chapel, there's two spots where Thomas appears. One is on the altarpiece that's dedicated to Sir Thomas More. Again, the two Thomases, I don't know if that was a particular affinity of Thomas O'Neill, but this chapel is dedicated to Thomas More, who was the sort of exchequer to, I think, Henry VIII. He didn't fare well in the end, but he was revered for basically not allowing Henry VIII to kind of mess with the status of the Catholic Church in England, and that's why he didn't fare terribly well. However, he's remembered here in this altarpiece. This is a 20th century altarpiece, but it's actually riffing upon a very famous portrait by Hans Holbein, a Renaissance portrait by the German artist Hans Holbein. In that portrait of St. Thomas More that you see, Sir Thomas More, who you see in the center there. And on the sort of side wings, some even more modern day characters. This grouping right here, you might be able to see the flames coming up there. That's actually depicting the Great Baltimore Fire. And I probably the only one who could see this because I'm close enough, but just behind there, that little block that you see there is actually O'Neill's dry goods store. It says O'Neill's, little sign is on it there. So it's showing how the flames stopped just before destroying the Thomas O'Neill's store. And here he's depicted as a schoolboy right here, very studious, studying probably his theology. He's in the company of his fellow schoolboys at a local Baltimore school, the name of which I'm forgetting right now. Does anyone know who one of his fellow schoolboys were?
Babe Ruth.
Babe Ruth, thank you, yes. So he's got his baseball bat there. I love this one because it really brings it into the present day, sort of what, even though it obviously has an ecclesiastical purpose, it's bringing it right up to the present day here in Baltimore right now. In that same chapel, on the right-hand wall as you enter, you have this series of stained glass windows, one of which is dedicated to Thomas O'Neill. And I find, again, this is not Thomas saying, I want this window. I don't think he left any instructions saying, I want to be pictured 5 times in the cathedral. People did that in the Middle Ages. This is all sort of just in honor of Thomas and honoring this great gift that he gave to the Catholic Church in Baltimore. I find it fascinating because, this is a fairly large scale window. So he's on the same scale as the various other saints that we see in our other cathedral windows. This was just a regular immigrant guy living in Baltimore in the early part of the 20th century. So I find that incredibly fascinating that he's sort of honored in that way. He's inscribed. You can tell exactly who he is. He's actually got there his missal.
Where are they located?
Where are they located? So when you, if you enter the nave of the church, on the left-hand side, so the south wall, if you go sort of almost up to where, I think it's right opposite the high altar, yeah? We've got the memorial chapel. It's a rather large chapel, and when you go into that chapel, this is just on your right-hand side. Look for the big readable with Thomas More. So if you look into the chapel and you see this big, very flashy golden altarpiece, walk right up to that, look to your right, and you'll see those windows.
Christine, they're all laymen too. So Thomas More,
Yes.
and then
He's listening. He's really listening. Yes, in this particular case, these 3 windows are of lay people. You're absolutely right. So but my point is, I've seen images of monks, for example. I wrote my dissertation on a German manuscript that was used in a liturgical context in a monastery. The sacristan had himself depicted 6 times in the manuscript. And I can tell you this is it. I mean, you think it's funny. It's actually completely unprecedented for that time period. It was made about the year 1200. So initially when I see people, image like Thomas More, I think, oh my goodness, this is pretty cheeky, right? But it wasn't actually Thomas's idea. I think these windows are very egalitarian. They're honoring the saints. They're also honoring people who lived good lives as Catholics, like Thomas. So, and I don't know much about the other 2, so we can talk about that. See, I was hoping nobody would ask about those other guys. And I'll show you the 3rd spot where Thomas O'Neill appears. And let me see, did I go too far? Oh, sorry, this is just a close-up of the one in the Memorial Chapel. I really think he looks like Teddy Roosevelt here. Maybe even more so here. The second place he appears is in the hallway leading towards the sacristy. There's stairs going down to the undercroft, and there's a series of windows on both sides. So if you go into that hallway heading towards the sacristy on your right-hand side, I should have incorporated a church plan. Sorry, everybody. There are brochures in the back of the church that will show you where these are also. There is this second stained glass image of Thomas O'Neill, and then I'm just going to focus on him there. He's really Teddy Roosevelt there. So here, this is kind of where I started the talk. He's same sort of, he's not kneeling, but his hands folded in prayer. Looks very much like that portrait of Louis XII, medieval king, showing himself as a pious individual in the context of the church in a place where he can be seen by the laity and also by the priests and deacons and so forth, and be thought of and contemplated. Because again, here he's identified, so we can think about him and his great gift to Baltimore as a patron. So this is one of the side chapels in our church, dedicated to St. Patrick, and I put him up just as sort of a little didactic tool, which you'll see in a minute. But the story I want to sort of conclude with is doesn't actually have anything to do with Baltimore at all, or Thomas O'Neill. In the case of Thomas O'Neill, he was really the sole benefactor of the creation and construction of this cathedral, and that was actually a fairly unusual thing. I was trying to think of another example of this in sort of recent history, and I certainly couldn't think of one, and then I was kind of poking around online, and somebody made the uncited claim that there's no other example of a single patron who paid for an entire cathedral in the history of the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. I would take that with a grain of salt. I'm sure we could probably dig somebody up, but certainly it was a very unusual thing for one person to be a sole benefactor of the creation and construction of a single cathedral. So more often, monumental projects like this are really the result of a sort of group patronage effort. I grew up in the suburbs of New York, and when I told my mother I was giving this talk and about my topic, she reminded me of a story that my grandmother, her mother used to tell her. So my grandmother was born in 1898 in New York City, and she spent a lot of her early life in Hell's Kitchen, which was really Hell's Kitchen at that time and not just expensive condos like it is today. And although I do have an Italian surname, my mother's side is Irish, like Thomas O'Neill. And so it was quite common for the Catholic immigrant populations, Italian, Irish, Polish, to kind of all intermarry in New York in that part of the early 20th century. I grew up calling it Gaelic garlic. Just heard that phrase. And according to my grandmother's story, my grandmother said that St. Patrick's Cathedral, obviously one of the most famous cathedrals on the planet, was actually built by the Irish Catholic maids who worked in New York City for the Protestant millionaires. And in other words, the Catholic workers in the service industry set whatever they could aside from their undoubtedly modest wages to put towards the building of one of the most famous and most visited Catholic cathedrals in the world. So very different from Thomas More, but it's very likely that in his case, he was really giving his surplus and they were giving from their need. So just to kind of keep that in mind as I move forward to my final slide. Now this is all sort of a very far cry from Henry Walters donating 22,000 objects and 2 buildings and an endowment to the city of Baltimore. This is also very different from Thomas O'Neill donating $5 million for the building of the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen. But there are, of course, modern examples of this kind of group patronage that I was just talking about with St. Patrick's Cathedral. Just this weekend, I was walking between the parish center and the cathedral school as I was walking my daughter over to Family Faith Formation in our monthly meeting, and she took a seat on this bench that some of you might be familiar with. And of course, right on the back of the bench, it says, and she was reading this, so what does this say? Well, it's the gift of the class of 2003. And on the paving stones right under our feet were the names of various families who had paid for individual stones to be laid. Obviously, constructing and sort of in the modern day was very expensive back in 1959, even more so today. So absolutely crucial that any sort of renovation to churches these days is somehow sponsored by individuals giving sometimes from their surplus and sometimes from their need. So with all this in mind, I hope that you might be inspired to become patrons yourselves, if you're not already, either of the arts, I have to say that, or of our cathedral or your local parish. So thank you.